Alright, making a video. Had a choice. Decided to go with the Gratex video. Yes, Gratex talking about sex. Boner killer, for sure. Mostly. Anyway, yeah, so anyway, this is a stupid argument. It's an evolution argument, actually, so that's what makes it worth talking about. So he's arguing with Broken Mech, and it's this semantics kind of argument, which comes first kind of thing. And there's a lot of different people posted comments on the video, which is unusual and strange. But anyway, it's hard to even paraphrase the argument, I guess, without... I should have directly quoted Gratex, but it just didn't happen that way. I don't have the direct quote. But the idea is that it's an argument about design. And it's an argument about whether you can use a word like design when there's a structure that forces something to comply. Like, you will not win unless you have these components. It's like you can't be the goalie, or you can't have specific jobs or tasks unless you have the necessary properties that those things have to do that certain thing. And so the fact that we have become motivated to have sex by a desire mechanism, pleasure, that it's part of the mechanism, but it's not really a direct mechanism if you look at it, right? I mean, the fact that we enjoy sex, or that we have a climax, seems almost incidental to the desire that motivates us sexually. I mean, the sensuality is also the arousal, let's call it, is a huge part of the mechanism of the hunger. It's not so much having the thing and enjoying having it. There's also this, the thing that gets you to having it is part of the game. And the pleasure might be what conditions us early on to create the manifestation that is the desire. But later on, it's almost superfluous. The desires already exist now. Once the desire exists, you almost don't need the actualization of the pleasure. The weird thing is that, this subject gets interesting, in my opinion, in looking at all the other kinds of animals and the kinds of ways their reproduction takes place. I mean, here we have a fundamental component. You have to do the consumption, things eat. That's pretty straightforward in all cases. Okay, that's not very complicated. Not much psychology involved in consumption of food. But now this reproduction thing, evolution's played a lot with that. And in many organisms, reproduction is the last act of their life. They'll be destroyed by it. They'll, if they knew what was going to happen, they might say, no thanks, I don't think I'll bother doing that swimming up the stream thing and getting morphed by the chemistry, the fresh water, getting killed in the end, and just for one squirt and I'm done. Maybe they'd stay in the ocean. Maybe they'd live another 10 years. Who knows? I don't know all that biology, but for salmon, it might be the way you want to live long and prosper. Don't reproduce. But for a lot of organisms, this is what happens. I mean, they swarm, they spawn, and they die. And we don't even know whether they actually experience pleasure in the process of spawning, because it's so... In some cases, it's a pretty brutal process. It's got some of that birth aspect to it. It's almost like your guts fall out. It's not quite the same thing. I mean, in some organisms, they literally, explode. And functionally die from having sex. It kills them. Directly. And like in the case of the salmon, your intent is for you to die and you to decompose, and the pieces of you will be the food for the young. It's that insidious. So anyway, but there's design in that mechanism. There's an obligation for there to be a correlation between these things. And Gratex seems to be arguing that it's somehow an in and of itself thing. It's an independent feature that's only by happenstance connected to sex. And it's not really a happenstance, it's a necessary stance. So you can't call it happenstance anymore, because the only thing that's going to survive are things that have that connection. So anyway, the only other reason why this I thought was worth making a video about is because it did make me think about possible thought experiments around the idea that if there was a designer, one of the features I would design if I was to make a Frankenstein would be, a little, orgasm button, and, let's say there would be rules about how often you could hit it, just, and it would work, just because we know we just sit there all day hitting it. But this idea that maybe, once every half hour you could have 90 seconds worth of orgasmic bliss by pressing a button. So, every half hour you were entitled to your 90 seconds, your hit. That would be a really interesting feature to have. When you're down, a little down, you just, I could use a little bliss, little, orgasmic pleasure, without any physical price, too. This is the other element to this whole argument, is that sex isn't exactly free for a male. I mean, it does wear you down. It does wear you out. You are producing something. It does take resources from your body to produce it. So it isn't free. And, in many species, other mammals, they have seasons for sex. And they rut and do all this other kind of stuff. And they kind of just, they go in kind of healthy. And they go out of the season kind of exhausted and wiped out. They got to build up again for next year's rut. So it's a real adventure. But I'm just saying that there's the connection though between this idea of these pleasures that we feel, these manufactured sensations our brain creates, do have a functional correlate. They're connected to some kind of utility that is produced over time in our activity. And so it's perfectly rational to connect sex to procreation. I guess that's what Gratex was opposed to. I think it's obvious that that's why it exists. The pleasure of sex is because the evolutionary correlation is between sex and reproduction. And that seems quite clear. We wouldn't have sexual gratification if we didn't reproduce through sexual activity. Sexual activity would be considered just dangerous activity. I mean, many organisms don't have sex very often just for the reason that it puts them in a compromised position. It's dangerous to have sex. And it's costly. Even going through the process of selection for who gets to have sex, for peacocks, and they came up in the conversation, and other animals, it's very taxing to their survivability to win the contest. The bird that collects all the little blue stuff to impress the female, and in turn demonstrates that he has so much spare time because he's such a good provider. He pays his rent so quickly that he has plenty of time to go collect blue shit. So he's just demonstrating how functional he is because he has all this time to collect blue shit. So there's huge waste in it. It's not designed as in purposeful, but clearly the function, it has a function, and you can't separate sex and the psychology connected to it from the fact that it has a collecting blue thing function. The stuff exists because of a direct correlation to an outcome that was favorable to the durability, survivability of the species. Duh. And Gratex seems to be arguing with that. So I'll play half of this crap. He's probably going to say that he always repeats everything 17 times. Okay. And so he should repeat whatever he said 17 more times in this 2 minutes.
And, experience in my interpersonal relationships as well, experience in talking with other guys about this kind of stuff. You know, I mean, we do have a deepness, we have depth, you know, we have all that kind of shit. But the main driving force is fucking sexual gratification, you know? And I don't feel guilty about that in the slightest, you know?
Okay, this is the wrong video. Okay, he doesn't feel guilty about that in the slightest. Well, that's fine, yeah. Well, I don't know who's obligating you to feel guilty about it. That would be kind of silly. Yeah, that's what that would be. Or stupid. But you are kind of stupid, so that would make sense. I don't know exactly how I pulled the wrong video, but I did. So this is the Gratex Broken Mech video. This is the one I want. And so we'll 12 minutes. Yeah.
Now,
we'll just go halfway.
So more little sexual gratification mutations possibly carried on to the next generation. And then that next generation, obviously, would probably have more sex than all the other non-mutated organisms, and so on and so forth. Now,
it's not about having more sex. It's having fruitful sex is sort of the point. So it's not even so much about the quantity of sex, it's the which one actually produces a viable offspring. It's the game that sex is designed, in the end, to produce. So there could be mechanisms that could even be part of evolution where sex is used as a way of even destroying the reckless, where there could be such a thing as reckless sex that doesn't end in procreation, but that does help in establishing, like that genetics has to be in the mix because it takes the waste genome and keeps it wasting itself. So there's 2 points to the struggle of survival, or the alpha mechanism. Isn't just creating the strong alpha, it's creating the stupid beta. So part of the mechanism is to force it into one extreme or the other extreme, and for that extreme to have behavior mechanisms that make its betedness decisive, that make it squander whatever it has.
There was no purpose behind that sexual gratification mutation. It just happened. It was happenstance.
Yeah, I mean, it's a silly word to use in this context. So, I mean, I hate to agree with Broken Mech because he's a complete and total asshole. But, I mean, it's just stupid to use a word like happenstance. I mean, happenstance is like something like there is no connection. And the connection is, the genetic connection is decisively forced. You will not be competitive unless this is the circumstance.
But it then had a feed-forward effect of increasing the likelihood of organisms with that mutation procreating, or at least having sex, and then that would lead to more procreation likely.
Yeah, but we already, like I said, we already know that it's more complicated than just having sex. The whole point is to have selected sex. That's the natural selection is. It creates a selection process. So although you're motivated to have sex, you're motivated to have sex in specific circumstances and in specific ways. I'm not talking about positions necessarily, but I mean ways in terms of the interaction between the players. And, you know, that's mutable by the circumstances they're maturated in. That's part of our developmental capacity, is to adapt to unique circumstances. And then part of it's this hardwired desire mechanism. But clearly our desire is funneled through conditioning to decisive preferences. We don't just stick it anywhere. Either sex. Both sexes are inhibited. They don't have sex with just anything, generally speaking.
But the mutation is an end in itself. The gratification is an end in itself.
At least, unless they're desperate, right? So that's a whole other concept is, if they're hungry enough, they'll eat anything, kind of thing.
It's not there for procreation. It's not as if the biology planned it, or the DNA approved it, or God designed it.
Well, it's stupid to say it's not like the DNA approved it. Of course the DNA approved it. Approved it in the sense that the obligations of the circumstance of natural selection through environmental attrition are going to obligate you to have this faculty. If you don't have it, your progeny won't exist and your genetic code will not further itself. So the connection has to be there between these two things. If you just spent your time masturbating, clearly you would enjoy your sexuality, but genetically it would not be a survivable mechanism.
Or the unconscious brain, is pulling your strings, making you do it. It just is. It's happenstance, biological.
It just is. I mean, see, how can you be preaching to other people about what the biology is, to say somebody else has a misconception about evolution, and you're going to use some sloppy language like happenstance. There's nothing happenstance anywhere, anytime. So it's just stupid to even use a word like that because it's technically on its face inaccurate. It's like saying it's spontaneous or something. It's just silly.
Who's speaking? It's the end in itself. Like dancing on your own, or singing in the shower, or masturbating. These are ends in themselves.
And who's arguing that they're not, from our psychological point of view? What the discussion is what is evolution? All right? And when evolution was in play, when we were still being naturally selected, when we were still functioning as natural organisms, clearly there was no chance that your genetic code was going anywhere if you masturbated.
We're not there to aid procreation. If that were the case, why do you masturbate? Why do you sing in the shower?
None of these things you wouldn't be doing any of those things without what's called this, intelligence, evolution of knowledge base, of cultural maturation. It's culture that creates those activities. Your natural the natural manifestation of those things would be like a howler monkey or something, okay? The function would be very different than the function of language. You'd be howling, at the world. You wouldn't be communicating with the world.
It's arguing we sing in order to propagate the species. That's ridiculous.
Well, he hasn't argued that. How can you do this? How can you call somebody ridiculous when you just so fucking completely strawmanned an argument? I mean, it's completely idiotic. Obviously, the connection between sex and reproduction is clear and hard. The connection between singing and anything is soft and weak. Singing is an emotional expression driven by cultural conditioning. That's all that is. What the expression of that singing, dancing thing would be in nature might be climbing a tree or doing some other activity that might have some more relevance to your constructive play, it could be even called. But it wouldn't be exactly the same as singing and dancing.
And it's a ridiculous thought born out of a misconception about evolution. These behaviors are ends in themselves.
They're just stupid. They can be, but that's not where they were created out of. They weren't created as ends in themselves. They're not even close to being buttons you press just for the sake of having fun. They're clearly mechanisms constructed for the function of reproduction. Clearly. fucktard. I mean, we would gain. There's no examples of gaining such pleasure. I mean, you can make the argument that sneezing is very pleasurable, and that one you might argue is by happenstance, and the pleasure is derived because the sneeze itself, the mechanism of a sneeze, is doing what sex does, in the sense that it's a rewiring, it's a rebooting of your sense organs. Okay, so the sneeze itself is not only cleansing your oratory mechanisms, your whatever these are, this nose mouth thing, air, but it's also clearing your ears and clearing the whole physiological system, and that's why you derive that moment of pleasure, is because it's basically turning all the crap off. So in the same, likewise with my argument that's where all pleasure is derived from, is pleasure is derived by a releasing of your burdens. So winning the lottery releases you of the burdens of all the encumbrances of worry and about money and all this stuff money's necessary for to function in the world. And you have this euphoria because you've been liberated. And the physical liberation is the orgasm or the sneeze. It's a kind of physical liberation, a liberation from your physical tension that you weren't quite aware of how. Like if you did take stock of how you feel at any one moment, you might realize that you have a lot of cricks and weights and gravity, and your shoulders are, your posture is poor, and different things are out of line. And if you could clear all of those in an instant, you might synthetically create a sensation like a sneeze.
Logically speaking, here's a behaviour, right? Look at this. Now, that might be somebody pulling a trigger and killing lots of people all day long, or it could be somebody stroking a little cat's chin. But biologically speaking, it's the same behaviour. But in the human realm, or the human feline realm, it's completely different behaviours. One of them's killing people all day, and the other one's being nice to cats. But
so again, I don't see how this has anything to do with the argument. Do you think Broken Mech doesn't know the difference? That he thinks that somehow it's mechanically different when you do different things? I mean, no one's making that argument. So again, this is just straw man nonsense. No one's making this imbecilic argument that you say they're making. They're saying that there's clearly an association, okay? Penises, you don't rub cats' chins with penises. That's not why penises exist, is to rub a cat's chin. There's not multiple purposes for penises. They have kind of one function. They do other things, the excretory, get rid of slop, which is unfortunate, right? If we were to do the designing ourselves, we would probably separate these functions, especially in women. Right? Duh.
to the biology of the human, the behavior of the human is the same. And that's what you don't get about evolution and biological imperatives. You're trying to relate the biology of an individual organism to the experiential outward existence of the human being in relation.
Well, I'm sorry. The fact that our psychology, at its root, the hardware of the psychology, is completely owned by the DNA mission of consumption and reproduction, survival of the fittest, the whole natural selection game. Yeah, that's where all that psychology comes from. Now, the fact that now we can manifest it or pervert it, essentially, to other purposes, we can make a gun and pull the trigger instead of picking raspberries with the same motion or whatever you want to analogize it to. The fact that we can use fingers for different things now because we can make tools doesn't mean that we have fingers before we had the tools. And we have the sex organs because they were conducive to replication, not to pleasure.
Into the environment. And trying to draw some causal connections with purpose in them. That's your error. You have to prove why that's the case. How does the biology know if I'm pulling a trigger and killing people or being nice to a cat? It doesn't know.
And again, I don't think, unless you're arguing that Broken Medic is arguing that somehow you couldn't take your sexuality and use it for some other purpose besides procreation. I think he's perfectly aware of the fact that you can have sex without procreation. So again, I don't see this. There's no argument here. You're just making silly straw mans.
There's no linkage there. The behaviour is an end in itself, and then that behaviour then has an impact on the rest of the environment.
How so? If you don't procreate, it doesn't really have an impact on the rest of the environment. I mean, what you do in your own bedroom kind of thing. No, I don't even buy it. Well, whatever.
A cricket or a grasshopper rubbing its legs together or its wings together or its legs against its wings or whatever it does, it's an end in itself. Okay?
Well, that's just silly. I mean, certainly from the individual grasshopper's perspective, he's not trying to accomplish anything else but rub legs together to make, he's not even trying to make noise. He's probably just obeying an instinct. This feels good. This feels like what I should be doing. My body wants to do this, so it does it. All right? It doesn't know that it has some bigger implication, that it's sending a signal to the females and they'll show up or some other kind. It doesn't know all of that. But clearly it's doing it because the DNA, okay, has ordered it, okay, by the confinement of selection. Selection is filtering this behavior into it.
Now it may attract other crickets, grasshoppers, whatever, to them, because the biology is attractive.
Yeah, there's nothing happenstance about it, though. The correlation between those events have been built into the players, so there's an obvious connection between the noise being made and the recipient receiving the signal. Both the receiver and the transmitter have been designed by natural selection for the purpose of creating the opportunity for procreation.
Acted to that noise as an end in itself. So you may find that two of those insects get together or are in close proximity, which will then increase the likelihood of them mating, which will then increase the likelihood of them procreating, and then propagating the gene.
But again, you're breaking your own argument here, because that's way too simplistic a view of the dance that has to be danced for the procreation. So that's only the first. Obviously, proximity is a requirement for there to be sex. So proximity will be part of the game played, but the game is going to be more complex. And all animals have a dance. All animals have a ritual. All animals have to go through a process before they get to the act itself that is, by the biology's function, likely to produce the prodigy.
But what's going on biologically is the desire to rub one's legs against one's wings and the desire to fly towards one.
Yeah, well, you don't even know if it's a desire. It might be just an itch, scratched. It might be an irritation that they're undoing. So they might not even be getting pleasure out of it, because they might be first imposed with a misery, and they're only getting rid of the misery of not doing it. If they don't do it, they'll be miserable.
And then the desire to have sex. Okay, that's what's going on biologically. not some kind of master plan to procreate or propagate.
Well, again, it's stupid. To say that there's not a master plan in the function of a DNA molecule is retarded. The whole function of the molecule is replication. Every faculty you have exists only to produce replication. That's it. That's the whole point of it, okay? There's no point. It wouldn't even have the consumption part if it didn't lead to the reproduction part. All right? We wouldn't even be eating if it wasn't for reproducing. So this is stupid. There would be no interest in even maintaining the existence of the new thing if the new thing was sterile.
Genes. That's a happenstance byproduct of all of these biological behaviors.
Again, it's just stupid. A happenstance of all of these biological behaviors. It's not an accident. Alright? I mean, there's obviously, it's not deliberate in the sense that an architect didn't write it down and say, build it this way. But clearly there was demands that it had to be built a certain way. When the things were thrown over there, the pieces of potentiality, when the genes were associated with each other, the only associations that would survive into the next generation over those 4 billion years of associating genes were genes that had associations that created these effects. The cause and effect chain has to be there. Those connections are solid. They aren't happenstance. They're obligatory. If you don't have them, you won't exist.
Now, that's a perspective. Okay. Your perspective is it all happens for a reason. There is no reason in biology. Evolution is a concept. Concepts can't verb. Concepts can't plan. Concepts can't desire. Concepts can't reward.
Yeah, I don't think he's saying any of those things. So again, this is more straw man. He's not saying the concept conceived it. He's not saying the thing, the DNA molecule, thought of it up ahead of time and then made it happen. I think he's arguing what I would argue is that the demands of functionality required it. You won't exist you won't survive the mass production process. You won't stay on the conveyor belt. You'll be defective. You'll be flicked off the genetic code, the surviving genetic code treadmill, or however you want to look at it, if you don't have these functions. So in that sense, they're imposed so draconianly, so absolutely, that they can be called something that is part of the function, part of the purpose, part of the design. But obviously it's a design created by the functions of the forces. The forces constrain. Planets won't be square, ever. They won't. They won't be square. They're going to be round.
These are things subject to. They're anthropomorphizing biological processes.
No, they're not processes in a vacuum. They're processes defined by force imposition. Forces connected to the function of replication, and that will decide what it can be in terms of its shape, its mechanisms, and its mechanisms are going to have to fit into this narrow field of description, or it won't exist.
Okay, and you're not alone, because most of the anti-theist, dogmatic Darwinist types on YouTube do the same shit. You can see it's like, so that's why we do that, because it aids us procreate. They always contrive every single biological behaviour to fit into some kind of, we do A to get to B. Okay?
Yeah, well, we do A because it leads to B in tendency, and you can't dispute that. I don't even think you are disputing that. So again, you're just playing a semantics game, a word game here. There's nobody saying that there's a intent, a preconceived notion of deliberation in the process of evolution. The argument is, though, is that it does confine and it does establish clear and substantial obligations of correlation between activities. Your sensations are going to be tied to some function, some byproduct, some product in terms of effect. You won't have causes in you that aren't connected to effects on the future.
I'm sorry, but that's invalid. We do A. We're doing A, and it may lead to B, but we're not doing it to get to B, biologically.
Well, biologically we are. Interpersonally we might not be. But the connection in terms of the biology's function is clear. The tires exist on the car because without the tires, the car is not going to be able to roll down the highway. I mean, you can't separate these parts from the function. The parts wouldn't exist if there wasn't a car in the end.
I mean, some people do have sex in order to procreate, but that's because they apply that purpose to the sexual act. Some people, or that same person another night may say, well, let's have sex.
Yeah, well, we can argue that, there's just no point in arguing this, because we know that none of the animals, none of the humans before, 20,000 years ago, none of them knew that there was a correlation between sex and procreation. They weren't thinking, I'm going to be making babies. Yeah, they were just having sex. Okay, but the DNA molecule clearly tied a connection between the sex and the procreation. You weren't going to have a baby unless somebody fucked you.
For fun. Let's have sex for money. Let's have sex for power. Let's have sex for revenge. Let's have sex to develop closer bonds.
Yeah, well, that's just all this psycho soap opera drama bullshit that's come out of cultural evolution. That has nothing to do with biology anymore. That has to do with completely changing how we're conditioned, because we're not conditioned in the real world anymore, nature. We're conditioned in an abstract world full of bizarre and bullshitty things.
Apply the purpose to the biological act, perceiving an end goal. But the biology isn't doing that. The biology is just doing it as an end in itself.
Well, again, there's no point in saying biology is doing it as an end in itself. The biology isn't doing it because it's getting to an end. It clearly doesn't have any motivating factors. It doesn't have any intent either. I mean, you're still playing with the word intent. There's no intent anywhere in any of the mechanisms. There's only function. And clearly, the function of our reproducing organs, the byproduct, is the pleasure. The function, the primary function, is the replication.
It's the human beings and sentient beings that are generating the purposes for themselves. The biology isn't, because it can't. Because concepts and chemicals can't work.
Well, whatever. It's, again, you wouldn't have the desire to have sex if sex didn't lead to procreation in tendency. It's just a fact.
So, anyway, there's that. Hope that helps you see a different perspective.
Yeah, no, it's just nonsense and rubbish. Semantics and bullshit. So anyway, I do think it's interesting to think about how we would redesign this capacity to desire and satisfy desire. And the distinctions in sex, like I said, that sex is just so much more complicated than this idea of a pleasurable act. because there is that whole aspect of it that based on the arousal of interest, and then the physical arousal, and the, both psychological and physical. And that is so much, that's the real mechanism, right? That's the thing that gets you to the trough. Eating is easy. Eating is almost nothing. Getting you to the trough was the tricky part. That's the real magic of the force, of the function of sex, is the fact that it creates this whole complex mechanism that says whacking off isn't quite good enough. In most cases or something. That there's something more that needs to get done. There's a certain aspect that keeps saying that in some kind of subtle voice. That there's a deeper hunger. Whatever. I think it's enough said. Yeah. I mean, sex is there's not much to us. Food, sex, and ego. That's all there is. I mean, ego is a tricky one, just because, it gets into all this, how you feel about yourself, your self-image. But that one is tied a lot to this sex thing. In some ways, it's like your image makes you more desirable, which makes you more capable of gaining the sex. So a big piece of ego is being distracted or bent, just for that purpose. And there might be some other ego that just exists for the purpose of feeling good about yourself for the sake of not feeling bad. Right? So I guess there's a benefit just to that. Feeling satisfied with your status. But yeah, that mechanism, unlike sex and food that doesn't have this direct correlation, is more of the mechanism, the piece of psychology that was thrown in because we were social animals. And we did do the collect blue things to impress the ladies, or we did do the beat the shit out of the other guy thing, or we did the internal alpha contest. And so it's for the internal contest within ourselves, competing with our own kind, that we do the ego thing, where sex and consumption have more to do with out-surviving the others. They're genetically different. Yeah. Okay, I think that's enough.